This is Lauren Bod. I'm here with Kathy and Alf Sharp and their home in Woodbury, Tennessee. It is January 11th, 2012. This interview is for Preserve the Area's Rural Qualities, a nonprofit organization that is interested in preserving the history of Readyville, Tennessee and the Readyville Mill. Kathy and Alf, do I have your permission to record this interview?
Yes.
You do?
All right, thank you. All right, Kathy, well, where are you originally from?
I was born in East Tennessee in Morristown. We moved around a lot when I was a kid, and I graduated from high school in Ohio and then came back to Tennessee to go to Vanderbilt, and been back in Tennessee ever since.
Did you graduate from Vanderbilt?
Yes.
What is your degree in?
English literature.
Oh,
Very
right.
useful.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I have a degree in history. So, but
That's right, similar.
yeah. All right.
You're using it.
Yeah. And where are you from, Alf?
I'm from Nashville all my life.
All right. And so when did you move here to the Readyville Woodbury area?
We moved here in the very late 1973, probably December of 73. I also went to Vanderbilt, Kathy, that's where we met. And we became interested in the back to the land movement that was part of the hippie culture. Back then we wanted to get to the country. And an offer came from the new owners of the Readyville Mill for us to come work there is what caused us to actually move down here.
We had, over the years, a couple of years before that, we had come to the mill as an outing. But when Joe Flipsy owned it, he had it restored. Really, it was perfectly restored. It had the old, it was stone ground. The mill run was running it. It was water powered. It was really a cool place. And we would come here to the mill and hang out. He had, I don't know, he must have had, I don't know how many kids he had. There were kids everywhere, and they were, and
Several different ethnicities.
well, he had been in Vietnam, and he'd married a Vietnamese lady, and they had children, but along the way they'd adopted a bunch of children for some, for whatever reasons. And so they had all these different children running around, and we had a small child, and we'd come and we'd buy flour and meal and whatever, and I used it to cook. I made bread with it. But it was a pretty drive. It was a nice day out, and they were very interesting people. Joe's mother was a librarian, and had researched grist mills at the Library of Congress and had done huge amounts of research on what this mill should be like. And they had actually restored the mill to what it originally would have been like. And then also we would come here occasionally to go geode hunting and caving. So that was what drew us to Cannon County.
And Joe was fascinated me. He was the most brilliant, intuitive mechanic, carpenter. You could give him a crowbar, and in 15 minutes he'd have it running. And he single-handedly resurrected the mill up out of the slump toward the creek. He jacked the building back up, which is an incredible feat. Reattached the turbine wheel, got everything running. He made boats for his children to play on the mill pond. He could do anything. He could just do anything, he could do anything with nothing. And that just fascinated me. I just loved listening to him, learning his mechanical techniques.
And I don't remember why they sold the mill. I don't remember why they decided to sell it, but they sold it then to the Carrignans, who were looking for somebody to help them. And Joe Flipsy recommended Alf because he knew how fascinated Alf was with it. So that's when the Carrignans hired us.
Joe had even taught me how to sharpen a millstone.
How do you do that?
Well, you've got a certain kind of a hammer that it's an odd look. It's a hammer, but it looks sort of like an axe twisted 90 degrees, and it's not as sharp as an axe. And the millstones have angular teeth ground on them, and you chop right at the apex of each of the teeth with this hammer, and it breaks away the dull. It breaks away the dull stone and exposes new sharp stone at the edge of each of the teeth. It's a fairly arcane talent, and I was really happy to have been able to learn it.
I think that millstone is lost.
That's what I understand. Certainly the millstone is not working.
Well, I don't think they have it.
Wow.
I think they've actually, some along the way, the millstone is gone. I'm sure that, I don't know what's happened to Joe Flipsy. I know where he lived after that on Jefferson Pike.
I think he's passed away.
That was, his mother had that house there, and there's still a bunch of junk in the yard. So I'm assuming that the Flipsies still own it. They had a tendency for dead,
picturesque junk.
but yeah, dead cool implements, farm implements and stuff, and they would just
machinery, machine shop machinery,
right, and they'd just leave it in the yard, irritating the neighbors no end. But there's I know where they lived, and I'm sure his mother is dead by now. And Joe was only a little older than we are, so I don't know, but as I understand that millstone has disappeared along the way because the mill went down very badly, starting with the Carrignans. After they got it put on the historic registry, thinking that would give them all sorts of possibilities for money, I think. But anyway, they were a very strange pair, and
very ill-suited to run a grist mill in the country.
Oh yeah.
What were they like?
She was a German Jew, and he was a flunked out Jesuit priest.
I don't think he was Jesuit. I think he was what's the it doesn't really matter. It starts with an F. The
Franciscan
monk. Yes. And she as a child she had been in the concentration camps.
Well, her parents died.
Yes, right.
So she had, and she'd actually had a very tragic life.
And it was marked by permanently.
And because her first family, her husband and 2 children or 3 children burned up in a fire that was set by one of the other children by accident. It was very tragic, but she was very old world. She still had a very strong German accent, and how on earth they ever got together, I don't know. But he was at the verge of taking his final vows as a monk or whatever, and left, and instead they met. They bought this mill. Later, after they sold the mill, she opened a bakery in Woodbury, where the Chilongos is in town now. It was a cute little building there, and she made really good bread. But I don't. They divorced. She moved out. I talked to her several years ago, but don't have any idea what's happened. She wasn't well at the time. She was a good deal older than we were. But they were very odd, and they were not people that the local people fell in love with.
No.
So
we didn't click. Kathy and I didn't click with them. So
particularly her.
When we moved down there in December, they gave us a trailer behind the mill to live in, and we stayed there for 3 or 4 months, I guess. But during that time, we just couldn't see eye to eye on virtually anything about how to run the mill or how much time we were going to spend or just virtually anything. So after no more than 4 months, we left the mill and just moved on into Woodbury. But during that, during the time when we would come down to visit Joe, and during those 4 months, I got to know a great deal about the mill.
Mm-hmm. So what year did you leave the mill?
It would be 74.
Spring of 74.
Mm-hmm.
No,
So-
or
that's
late
right.
winter, yeah, something like
So before then, when you were working with the Flipsies, so you said you got to know a lot about how a mill runs and everything. So
Right.
did you all like produce flour and everything there too,
Yeah,
and cornmeal?
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he produced wheat flour, corn flour, buckwheat flour. Um,
He even did a white flour. He did
yeah.
some, and then sold the brand separately.
Hmm.
They had a wide range of milled products that they did right there. I mean, and you had to run. They run corn, and then they would run a different grain, and and it was always freshly done. It was always for sale at the mill. I don't think they ever marketed it anywhere else except the mill, though. I don't remember.
I think they did, like the Sunshine Grocery in
Yeah,
Nashville.
maybe so.
Things like that. Uh, and they had, they had local honey and local jams and that sort of thing. But they really did. They made the use of all of each of the kernels. You'd go all the way from cracked corn, where each of the pieces was about the size of a BB, all the way down to corn flour. And each of those was a refinement process that took place in another machine up on the second and third floors of the mill. And there were all of these wonderful old wooden chutes and combination of chutes and wooden augers that would move the material up and down the from floor to floor, depending on which machine it was going to, and which lever you pulled to move it from one chute to another. And that they were, I loved them particularly because they were made of great long straight pieces of deep dark green heart poplar from trees that were probably nearly 200 years old. That from trees that had been probably cut 150 years ago, and they were just beautiful. They were simple, but they were beautifully done. They had a nice little hand planed bead on each edge of every board that made these chutes. Whoever built that mill took a great deal of pride in their simple country craftsmanship when they first put it together. It was very nice.
Do you know anything about Charles Reedy, the man who first built it in 1812?
No, I don't.
You don't.
I remember Mamie Reedy.
However,
There were Mamie and her sister. There were two of them. They lived right down there in the big Reedy, not in the fancy Reedy house, but they lived on the down there in Readyville, and their parents sisters.
The last man who ran it before the Flipsies bought it, and it had been moribund for quite a while. The last man who ran it that we heard anything about was Mr. Justice.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I believe that the mill that was built in 1812 was not this mill.
Yeah, it burned in
yeah.
the Civil War and
Right.
it was rebuilt.
And so those the poplar shoots that I was talking about would not, unfortunately, have come from 1812.
Yeah.
I mean, goodness, every one of those boards would be worth a king's ransom today if
Are they still there?
So very few of them, and
I
they've
haven't
just
been
like
upstairs.
everything else, they've been let go.
Yeah, our daughter was in interior design school at O'More in Franklin, and they had to do a senior project, and she chose the mill. It's a fantasy project, but you have to plan the whole thing. And in her plan, she turned the mill into a restaurant, with the mill actually functioning, but like behind plexiglass or something, so that you wouldn't get the dust everywhere.
And a little inn.
Yeah, and one of the side buildings she was figuring would be a bed and breakfast, but her husband went and looked at the building at that time, and this is before Tom Brady bought it, and said that building was sliding so bad it would take so much money to jack it up and get it square again. So it's really remarkable that Tom Brady has done what he's done, because it's, he rescued it from it falling in. And of course the mill run doesn't work anymore. They haven't restored that yet. and they don't have the millstones. So he's just using some sort of makeshift thing. We've been by there.
Yeah, I went and saw it too.
Yeah, and I mean, it's cute what they've done, but it's a shadow of what it was under Joe Flipsy.
When it was running, when it was all running, there were what are called grate shafts all over the building, which are very large metal shafts that hang from the ceiling with big pulleys on them. And there were big, long, wide leather belts that went from one pulley on the grate shaft down to each machine. And then there would be a master pulley and a master belt that would go from floor to floor to each floor's grate shaft. And then up at the very final top little cupola of that building was the final grate shaft. And it was sitting up there distributing power back down to all these different places. And the first three floors had nice solid floors. That fourth place up there just had this little spider web of boards with lots of big holes between them that you had to walk across to service those grate shafts. And it was way, way, way up in the air. And it was always a little bit intimidating to climb up in there and oil the grate shafts or switch the belts. But if you can imagine when the mill is running, you're inside and there are belts. You know, sometimes the distance between the pulley on the grate shaft and the machine might be 30 or 40 feet. And so there's this big belt, 8 inches wide, that's going flap, 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 flap as it runs from the grate shaft down to the machine. And a lot of times there'll be several running because the augers are also running off of the grate shaft. So there are these big leather belts just stretching out in every direction, not particularly organized looking, flapping in the air in this mill as it's running. It was quite a sight. I think back and realize how few people ever get to see such a thing.
Yeah.
Today.
Well, Brown's Mill floated away.
Yeah.
And
there's Falls Mill down there in outside Winchester.
Mm-hmm. Is it run? I don't know if
I don't know if it's running either.
They have a restaurant there. I don't think they run the mill. I just think they have the restaurant now.
Yeah, I've heard of it. I don't know if
it's a very nice restaurant. We've eaten there, but
you're thinking of the one outside Tullahoma.
Yes.
I forget the name of it, and it's a great restaurant. But no, there's that Falls Mill. It's between Winchester and Fayetteville.
Oh, okay.
Down on 64.
And I don't know about that one.
We've been there.
Yeah, I just don't know anything.
It was a long time ago. And it was running when we were there, but not. It was a much later mill, so it looked much more like, rather than looking like a Rube Goldberg made by local folks, it looked like a more efficient factory. It was still, stone ground, or maybe it wasn't. No, as a matter of fact, I don't think the Falls Mill was metal ground right from the start.
Well, there was some flour mill in Manchester, but it was metal from the beginning.
Right.
Yeah. So this was an oddity. I mean, in the mid 70s when we first, early to mid 70s when we first started going, it was quite a sight, and it was right at the peak of all of that interest in natural foods, starting all of the Sunshine Grocery in Nashville had opened up as a health food, natural food store, and
that was a new thing.
It was very new.
and the whole Mother Earth news.
And Organic Gardening magazine, all of that was brand new. And so they were right on the cutting edge of that. And so a lot of people were interested in it because they were interested in more natural things and the, calmer way of life. It was also right on the end of the Vietnam War, and people were just worn out with that sort of thing. So they were looking for that idyllic spot, and the mill was beautifully kept. I mean, it was busy all the time, and it was a fun place to go. And then I didn't go to the mill after we didn't work with the Carrignans. I don't think I went back to the mill for a long time. I did go when she made good bread. But then the next people that bought it from the Carrignans,
Epperly?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, just let it go down. Just and we're asking an outrageous amount of money for it, and that was totally not worth it because of how much you were going to have to put into it. It had gone downhill pretty badly with the Carrignans because they really did not know what they were doing. But it basically, really and truly, I think the wake up call in a lot of ways was when the Browns Mill floated away, and because the Readyville Mill wasn't far behind, and there was this group, the PARQ group, that really spurred an interest in it because they could envision it being completely gone, but Eberly did not have any desire to sell it to them, so. So I don't, and then he died, heirs got it, there was still some bargaining, and I don't know how Mr. Brady finally got them to convince them to get it, but he's done a good job of restoring the property. It would be really cool if he could actually restore the mill, but it was, because the mill run isn't working, and it would take a lot of effort, I think a lot of money to...
I think the shaft, the main shaft that goes from the turbine to the Millstone is bent now too. Not that couldn't be repaired, but I mean that would be a big
major
deal.
project. Yeah.
And if the Millstone's not there, it's not that you can't obtain millstones today, but they're not common.
No. So.
Well, you said that you were interested in the Back to the Land movement, and what originally got you interested in that in the 70s?
Well, Kathy really liked gardening, and I became interested.
I didn't garden until after we moved here. I never gardened in Nashville.
Sure. Well, I mean, didn't we have a garden on Brighton?
No.
Okay. Well, I was probably the one that was the most infatuated with the whole idea. I had gotten interested in the Whole Earth Catalogue, which was a phenomenon in itself. And it was primarily a books. It was the catalog featured books. But it was a whole essay in itself about self-sufficient living and rediscovering old methods, and along with that was the fascination with Buckminster Fuller and his geodesic domes, and the possibility of making low-cost, low-impact housing out of geodesic domes, with rogue hippie carpenters, and so I got involved in that, and again there was a very strong a whole big part of that was this idea of what does it say in Woodstock in the song Woodstock that Joni Mitchell wrote, it was Stephen Stills, either one of the two, that said, we've got to get back to the land and set our souls free. That's one of the lines in the song Woodstock.
I thought that was not Stills, but the other, Neil Young.
It may have been. But anyway, it was the song Woodstock, and it's what a whole lot of countercultural people were doing at the time.
Well, there was a lot. You realize it was on the tail of the protest movement against the war, there's always these swings in society, and what it was is that there was a rejection of the military industrial
middle class suburban bourgeoisie.
Babbitt, John Updike novels, that kind of mindless walking forward lifestyle that just, that a lot of young people were rejecting because they thought there has to be something more, something better, or something richer, in a sense. Not interestingly though, that movement was not very successful. A good many of us are still back in the country for various reasons, but almost all of those that were involved in the movement were middle and upper middle class people with education, and it was hard to live like that. It's hard to live that poor, and so most of them all of us went back to real jobs, went back to, some way to, people still kept gardens maybe, or, they kept a piece of that, but it's just, that was not an easy lifestyle.
I still work in a one-man shop in at the end, in a little holler in a small town.
We had a vegetable garden for years here until I just couldn't keep up with it anymore. We have a number of friends in this area in a similar way. This place is very good for cottage industries, which is basically what we are, both of us. That's about all you can do here because there's really no other job. So you have to be able to support yourself or be willing to drive 50 miles or more to get to work. So the people who lasted here, they still have gardens. They still have an interest in more natural, eating natural foods. We have a very good food cooperative here where we can get really good natural foods, and we have access to a lot of that, the valuable stuff that came out. But everybody, mostly, they had to find some way. They started selling their pottery, and they did really well at it, or like Alf builds furniture, a lot of other
jewelry.
And the cool thing is that the Cannon County's always had a craft ethic, and we had the oak baskets and the greenwood chairs that were being made here. But these people, those baskets are stunning, and they were getting virtually nothing for them. And when a lot of the back to the landers hippies moved in and started, this county was very interesting because the move-ins and the old craftspeople got along, and it elevated the prices that the older people got, and the more recognition came their way as a result of this community becoming so cottage industry craft or oriented. And
it's the main reason that we have the art center out there on the highway, which is an incredible thing for a town 10 times Woodbury's size to have.
Yeah. That was a lot. Richard Northcutt coming back from UT. He'd done theater.
Well, but it was also Arlen Indy. She was a weaver.
And her husband
was an artist in various mediums, steel and concrete in same way. But they were back to the landers as well, and
they were so old they'd been beatniks.
Yeah, that's right.
They were a generation older than we are, and they'd always been counterculture. So they were, and they had been real involved with it too. But it's been an interesting thing because a lot of communities that didn't blend as well as this one did, and a lot of it I think was because the people that moved in were really trying to get what a lot of these local people already had, which was a self-sufficiency and a sustainability that was valuable, and it was going. I mean, everybody's moving to Michigan or driving to Nashville or whatever for work, and small farms are almost impossible to keep anymore. But the crafts group, I mean, after that, the Smithsonian took several of they have a big crafts fair on the July the 4th, and they took various Cannon County these older ladies that were doing the baskets, and they went to Washington D.C. One of them had never left the county. She had never been out of Cannon County in her whole life.
Wow.
And she went and demonstrated in Washington D.C. So it brought a whole lot of focus on some of these local crafts that are now still being taught and still being practiced here. So those baskets might have gone by the wayside. They're so hard to make. Yeah. And if that interest hadn't happened. So yeah, it's that was part of what was going on. We were amongst the early ones to move in. There were a few, but around 1970 or 72, people started moving in here. Land was cheap.
Very cheap.
Real cheap.
Lots of old abandoned farmhouses that people could just rent just for fixing them up. And actually, they were the kind of houses that most people at the time wouldn't have wanted to live in anyway. It was a lot like camping out. And for us middle class kids from the suburbs, it was like camping out for a year or two before, like Kathy said, it really got to be hard work to just keep doing the same thing.
Staying warm in the winter.
Yeah.
But one of the funny stories is because people would buy a house like this one, right? And when we bought this house, it was all wallpapered. This house is a little sturdier than some of them. One of the first things people would do is they'd come in and they'd peel all that old wallpaper off the wall because it was ugly, and find out the reason it was there is that's all that was keeping the wind out of the house. So, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? And they'd partition little spaces just enough to keep warm. But it was, I'm sure a lot of the old folks around here got a big laugh out of some of that,
It was fun. It was great. It's still great. I love having done it, and I love being here now. And we wouldn't be here if we hadn't been invited to come work at the mill. And I'm still just thrilled at the course that our life has taken.
Now, we bought this house in
76.
Was Emily born in 77?
Well, you'll have to. I know we bought this house in 76.
Okay. And in August of 76 we moved in here, and it wasn't as bad as a lot of them were, but it was hard to keep it warm. And you'll find that almost everybody like at the same time bought these older places, and they're very different than what they started out. As you were able to do that, and the ones that lasted, others moved on.
Yeah, at the peak, I would say if you took into account Smith County and DeKalb County and Cannon County, there were maybe 600 people who had moved in this way as back to the landers, and to one extent or another, most of them would identify themselves as hippies. There were an interesting few that really didn't have any real identification with the hippie movement as such. They just had a lot of identification with the back to the land movements. You remember the old couple from New York who had a dairy farm?
Wava.
Nelson and Wava. And I mean, they were like our grandparents, but they were always, whenever we'd have a get together, they'd be there, and we'd have a co-op meeting and distribute food, and they'd be there. It was a lot of fun, really.
Did you identify yourselves as hippies?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
We certainly did.
And you said you already had a child at that time too when you worked at the mill, and you worked at the mill as well, right?
Well, sort of, yeah. That was Marie Kerrigan had this very European view. I think she thought she was hiring a servant, and that's part of the reason it didn't work out. But so anyway, no, I did some when I would do sales and stuff at the mill, but I didn't do any of the physical stuff like he was talking about. I didn't get to do any of the. It wouldn't have climbed up into the top there anyway, but don't like heights. But we didn't.
Well, honestly, they ended up running the mill very little because what's his name? What was his name?
Bill.
Bill was intimidated by the thing, and it's intimidating to someone who is not really fascinated by machinery and doesn't have a slightly crazy bent to them, And after a few weeks, he ran it very little, and he ran very, very little of the machinery, and they ended up buying their product from somebody else, didn't they? And repackaging it in Readyville Mill bags.
I don't remember that. I hadn't remembered that. Yeah.
Because between being willing to walk around these flapping belts and sort of jump under one and over another one to get here, and
that was not his style.
No, and checking on all the bearings for grease and being willing to crawl out here or under here. It just, the whole thing intimidated him, really.
Well, and people didn't much like dealing with her, and so when she would be in, making sales and stuff, that was one of the reasons I didn't work there, because when we would all be there, people would automatically talk to me, and it would make her very angry because she owned it, and they always preferred to talk to me, because she just had, I mean, as we said, she had a tragic life, but she just had this very Germanic view. And it just didn't sit well with people who came to the mill not just to buy something. They came to see it. It was an
experience.
Yes, yeah. So, and so it didn't last long under them. And then it just kept going down. So it's really nice to see what's happened since then. It would be really cool if they could actually restore it, but just how much money that would take. So
Combination of money and ingenuity, the kind of ingenuity that Joe Flipsy had,
Yeah.
and he was really 1 in a million. He's
Yeah.
probably 1 in 10 million as far as his range of skills, and his energy and range of skills, and willing to just figure out a way how one man could lift a whole building up out of the river and back up onto the hillside.
Yeah, it was a rare combination, and he liked the community. He liked, after they left there, like I said, they just moved into Rutherford County, not that far from here, really. So I think maybe his mother already lived there, but they fit in with the community. Even with all those motley children.
Well, I think the motley children contributed a great deal. I mean, they had, like Kathy said, they had several of their own. They had adopted at least one Vietnamese child. They had adopted an African American child. And the kids were always running around.
Yeah, they never stood still long enough to actually have any idea how many there were. So I never did have any idea how many children they actually had there, because they could have had others visiting, and
And you wouldn't call Joe a hippie by any means, but he was definitely countercultural.
Yeah.
His vision of life. He marched to a different drummer.
Yep.
And he was perfectly simpatico with all of the hippy dippy Aquarians who were fond of his place.
Yeah, it was. His mother was an interesting person. She was fascinating, very bright woman. His father was around then too, and he was also engineering minded.
Right, he was an aviation engineer.
That's right. They were interesting people.
And Joe had been a machinist mate in the Navy, so I mean he really did know machinery.
I knew he'd been in the military, but I didn't know that's what he did.
Yeah.
So, did he serve in Vietnam?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that how he met his wife?
Must have been. Yeah.
And he was very early in Vietnam too.
But do you know his wife's name?
Don't remember it.
It's right out there. It's right in there.
I don't remember it at all. It's too long ago. And she was very in the background. I don't know how.
She was pleasant.
She was very pleasant.
She was not squelched.
No,
she was just quiet.
She was kind of shy, and it's a strange culture for her. And all these people there around. She was always very pleasant to people. I don't know how good her English was either. She might have been a little intimidated by crowds of people in a foreign, and what would be a second language. But she was always, she worked there. She was always hanging around there. So she was definitely part of it. She just wasn't in the mix as much. And Joe basically just sat on the porch and waited for everybody to come to him. Oh, my phone. I've got a new phone, and it makes these funny new noises.
So, did you ever serve in Vietnam?
No, I didn't.
Were you anti-war?
Yes,
Yeah.
pretty strongly. It's hindsight is sort of a little corrupted, but I suspect that I would have gone to Canada if I'd been called up. I don't suspect that I would have been able to go.
Well, you did everything in your power. You
Yeah.
never did. He never got called. He never got called from the draft. His number. First, he had a child. Then
Stayed in college, had a child, got married. Then
when they started the numbers, the lottery numbers, your number wasn't close enough. You never
Right.
got that number came up, so it never was an issue. And he
I
says
had to go down and register and
Right.
and do the whole physical and all that sort of stuff.
but they never. Yeah, but I'm not sure that he would have gone to Canada. I think that would have been a real hard, given his family. I'm not sure that they would have. That would have been something. I mean, I think your father would have killed you before he'd let you do that. But his father was ex-Navy
Okay.
and had been in World War II, and I don't think that would have been. Although it might have been tempting, but that was a pretty serious decision. That I just heard an interview with Jesse Winchester over that, this singer, and he went to Canada. And it was interesting to hear him talk about what impact that had on his life, and not necessarily all positive, So anyway, I don't know that everybody we hung out with was anti-war. I mean, seriously anti-war, and mostly still are.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Mostly still feel the same way.
I saw a bumper sticker the other day. I loved it. It said, "I'm against the next war too."
So, that was all part of the same thing. I think it was just that people were so burned out by all of that happening at that time too. The late 60s were, really and truly, the late 60s were extremely chaotic. You realize how many people were assassinated in 1968?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a pivotal year. I mean, 68 is
certainly is.
just an amazingly pivotal year. And how it affected you, I think, really did set your life course. Those of us that were
Right,
young, we were in college
At a certain age, an age bracket of about 4 years in there.
How old were you two in 1968?
20.
And still in college, and Vanderbilt being a very, very conservative school. It was interesting when Martin Luther King was assassinated. All of the psychology professors put black armbands on, and but there are a lot of people at Vanderbilt who were happy he was gone. It was, they did not see him. He was not viewed by a lot of white conservatives, which Vanderbilt was mostly made up of, that as a positive force in the world. And there were people that I heard that were, actually happy that he was assassinated.
They were.
And I think that was also pivotal for some of us too, to encounter those dichotomy reactions.
Well, I think some of it was, to one extent or another, we had all been partially just compliant to that Southern bigoted way of life,
Well, those of you,
less. But
because
me,
I lived
for
other
example,
places, yeah.
Growing up in Nashville, that was just part of the culture. It was just part of the fabric of the culture.
You didn't think about what went on the other side of town.
And I think at any time, if you had pointed out a lot of the injustices that became more apparent, I would have reacted poorly. I would have reacted against them. But at that point, it was, you had to make a choice. You could no longer just sort of rock along and realize that really, the black people had been getting a terribly raw deal for 150 years. Or you had to either decide that you were for segregation or that you were completely against it. And, young people are still idealistic enough, thank heavens, that most of us just recognized, and that's just the one. That's segregation. That was one issue. Then there was the Vietnamese War. Those two huge things.
My experience was different than his because we moved so much, and I had, when I was in Massachusetts at a base school, it was already integrated because the military had integrated, And then I was in Charlottesville, Virginia, and they closed our schools rather than let black kids in when I was in the 5th grade. And we went to school in the basement of somebody's home that for a semester. And they opened it back up and they integrated it. But that school had a terrible problem. And I remember being in the 4th grade and seeing all these little black kids outside our playground fence and looking for black faces in school. And I couldn't find any in school. I couldn't figure out why there were no black faces in school, and they were all standing on the outside. And then the next year the school closed, and they had, the history of that school is very interesting because they had a lot of trouble. Almost all the people there were at the University of Virginia. Their kids were going to school there, and it was a fairly elitist school academically, and they resisted for a long time. And then when I got to Ohio, we were outside the military base with the school was not very integrated because the community was not. There were very few black people in that community. It was basically a farming community. But then when we got to Vanderbilt, and our freshman class was the first black basketball player in the SEC. And so, and then I taught in Nashville through the segregation and integration.
I don't know how much you're aware of Nashville's history, but Nashville, especially for a southern town, was rather forward in accepting desegregation. And so consequently, I mean, there were a few hard nights of near riot early on, that sort of thing. There were lunchroom sit-ins. There was never any gross violence, and the city accommodated the change pretty quickly and pretty willingly. Was it Beverly Briley that they caught him on the steps? Who was it?
Ben West.
Ben West, that's right. It was Ben West.
He's the mayor.
He was the mayor, and he was standing on the steps talking about some of the things that had happened, and somebody just pointed out something that had just recently happened, and they said, "Mr. West, is that right or is that wrong?" And he just stopped for a minute. He said, "That's wrong." Pretty good for a southern town in the mid to late 60s. So, that that sort of helped some of us who were brought up with being bigoted. I was proud of Nashville.
After I graduated from Vanderbilt, I taught in Nashville for a while, and it was through the
black
busing.
School.
Yeah, in an inner city black school during the busing time. It was a very interesting period. That would have been I started in.
And by that time,
1970.
we were pretty hardcore hippies.
Or transitioning.
You had to keep a certain demeanor, but I mean, you were still.
Yeah, well, I was definitely counterculture to most of the other teachers.
But as a result,
the kids
you especially, but both of us were kind of welcomed into the black community.
Well, I know I was very well protected. I was
as sympathizers, and
the kids liked me.
No, the whole community took care of Kathy. I mean, they loved her to death.
Well, I was active in the football stuff and basketball, and I did stuff with the kids, and I got the job, I think, because the interviewer recognized that I wouldn't have problems being in a black school. He knew that the only jobs he had open were going to be in a rough neighborhood, and I was 2 weeks out of college when I got the job. I was young. And I was white and I was naive. And I started in the middle of the year, and the previous teacher they'd driven her to a nervous breakdown. So it was a very interesting it was a very valuable experience for me. But a lot of that got me very involved in the whole. I mean, I'd witnessed so much of it through the course of my life already, but that also got me very much more interested in the whole civil rights, and in a larger sense in civil rights. Not just for black people, but for all people to have really radical ideas like everybody should earn a living wage. Yeah, that sort of really counter, you know, and I used to have a little health food store in town, and we used to have shirt factories here. It was the only industry that ever really was here, and it was largely because northern companies moved their stuff down here where there were no labor unions and where they could get away with basically paying virtually nothing. I mean, their work tactics were abominable, their methods, but the president of it used to come by and buy stuff from me, and we would argue over economics and how you should run a business, and he would do, you know, and I said, how can you get away with, how can you do this? This is unconscionable that you treat these people this way. And he said, it's business. So, you know, that all of those things sort of were part of what we were reacting to. It wasn't just it was the inequities that we saw in the, you know, in the whole socioeconomic system. Not that we've made any dent in it, but not that we've changed the world like we thought we might. That hasn't happened.
So, did you two ever take place in any sit-ins or protests or anything like that?
I took part in several
Some
in Nashville.
marchings, yeah.
What was that like?
Peaceful.
Yeah, we never got into the
We never had
the Chicago sort of things.
Yeah.
In fact, one of them, one instance is one that is one of the greater things I regret in my life. It was a very hurtful thing that I did. My father was a fairly prominent businessman in Nashville, and a bunch of us went down in front of his bank downtown and marched, and you know, and would had signs and all that sort of stuff. And a bunch of his different friends were coming out of the bank, you know, and they all knew me and would come up and ask what I was doing. They were all upset, you know. I didn't need to rub it in my father's eye that way. It was a pointlessly harmful thing to do, which I wish I had never done. But in the heat of the moment, when you're
idealistic and you're convinced you're right.
That young, you know.
Yeah. That was that. You know, that really. It's interesting to watch some of the idealism change too. I recently, I mean, this is rather political, but was just shocked to find out that somebody that was a dyed-in-the-wool hippie with us all those years ago stood in line for 2 hours to get Sarah Palin's autograph.
Who was there?
Laura Surratt.
Oh my God, that's right.
And I went, it's like, you traitor after all that.
Not only traitor, how could you abandon your mental faculties to that extent? Oh my goodness.
So, it's like, oh, okay, you know, that's really funny, yeah, so. And her husband was one of the hardest core.
Oh yeah, he was a real radical. He was a.
But a lot of them went back to much more comfortable, you know, went back
to the country club.
Back to the country clubs. Mm-hmm. You know, it was an easier life. They knew the rules, and they knew how to. You know, it was just, you know, they had central heat and air, and things were a lot better. But the people that came here in the 70s that stuck it out are all a pretty interesting bunch of people. Because they've made their lives easier than that. I mean, they all have, you know, incomes, and you know, but they've kept the parts of it that are valuable to them, and they like the sense of community.
And there's some that are still quite. I mean, when you think about William Coingo, he lives off the grid. He lives back in a holla. He generates his own electricity. He built his own log cabin. He's a fine sculptor, and his little valley is beautiful. He's filled his little valley with pieces of sculpture. But they live very simply, and they really do. They still live successfully by most of the tenets of the the strong back to the land movement of 40 years ago. David and David Zabriskie.
They have jobs.
Oh, I know they have jobs, but yeah, it's true. It's true. They have jobs, but
She and her mother own a business together.
oh, I didn't know that. But they still very much
I don't know.
pursue that.
I mean, they've
Karen.
they've upscaled their lives a whole lot. The Bernie and Nancy Coombs here have done similarly. I mean, they have nice lives, and they still grow vegetables, and they work every day. He's the chiropractor in town. She's a massage therapist, and but they have a sort of counterculture sensibility still. That I don't think I have much anymore. I don't not that I don't have certain things that. And I've still very strong feelings about fairness and equality. I've always felt that way. So I think I had that before I was a hippie, though. I think that's just part of me. But it was a good community to raise kids and have all this land around us, and they had all acres and acres of woods that they would run through, and. It's a safe community. I know there's all the stories about, and there have been some really brutal stuff that's happened in this community, but it doesn't happen.
It's never random.
It's not random. Only those guys that know each other. They only kill each other.
Yeah, that's right.
It's
grudges and family and
and so that's drug deals gone bad amongst people that know each other. It's just you would never it would be just totally over the top to believe that there would ever be a drive-by shooting in Cannon County. Although there are plenty of guns here, they don't. It's not random that way. So you don't really worry about. I mean, to this day, a lot of people never lock their doors. There's theft. But once again, it's people who know what you have in your house. It's who you run with. That and drugs have been a big issue here. That's become a methamphetamines, and that's changed the community a lot. Over the drug culture has. That really hardcore drug stuff. But mostly, if you take care of yourself and mind your own business, it's a nice place to live.
Yes, it is.
When you first moved out here and started working at the mill and everything, did you live in a house that had electricity?
We always had electricity and a flush toilet.
Okay. That's good. Did you know people that didn't?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Plenty.
Yes.
Plenty.
Especially the flush toilet part.
Yeah.
A lot of people, had outhouses. They thought that was very romantic and cool, but I never did. But the thing is that this community's always been on the hard scrabble farm poor side, so that wasn't much different than everybody was living out here.
I made tight friends with an old timer here, who was probably born around the turn of the century, and he said he can remember when airlines were regularly flying over Woodbury, not special planes, but regular American Airlines, Pan Am, TWA flying over Woodbury before Woodbury got its first radio.
Rural electrification made a huge difference here and that's why you see houses so close to the road, is so they could get services, but they, it was the 40s.
No, it was passed in 1954.
Okay.
Woodbury had electricity before that.
In
and
town,
it was because
but not
Mr. Hoover's
mill.
This is another mill. Yeah. Mr. Hoover's mill
generated it.
And
the Readyville Mill generated electricity for a while too. But Woodbury proper had electricity, but this house was built in the 30s.
It was electrified in 57 or 58 or 59 though. See.
And this house did not have, when it was built, did not have a bathroom. And
Or a kitchen.
Or the
really.
kitchen. The kitchen was added first.
Uh-huh.
And when we bought this house, there was a doorway. There was this house. There were 3 rooms back here, and there was a doorway right there. And they cut this hallway, and they made that into the bathroom. And it's so that's how this house ended up with a bathroom. And they put a septic tank in just for the bathroom, and they didn't hook the kitchen water to it. So it's still gray water going out. We're grandfathered in on that one too. But they did things like the toilet was downhill from the septic tank, and they cut a floor joist to put the toilet in. It's just like, oh my goodness. But the house was sturdy, from the beginning, which is also unusual. These were the people that owned this place were prosperous farmers. They farmed the hills. They owned probably around 200 to 300 acres, yeah. And there's a field up at the top that they would have.
All this. I mean,
they did corn. Actually, there was an orchard right behind the house that's all died away. It was bad by the time we got here, it was. It had been a farm before that because the Roaches had owned it before that. So, you can see it. You can see the county's history right here in this house, pretty much with the.
This started in the 30s. Mm-hmm. It was built in 38.
The other house that they had was over there is burned down, and so they went to church one night, came home, their house was gone.
Wow!
And they built this one, and that wouldn't have had
electricity
or water probably.
No, this house didn't have electricity until because the Rural Electrification Act was 1954, but the rural counties weren't effectively all gotten out to until 1960 or 61 or 2, And so I'm guessing, being only 3 miles from town, this would have been early. 57.
This would have been. Yeah, I think that's.
But for most places, all that meant was a single light bulb hanging from a cord on the ceiling, and
one outlet in the room.
Right, and a refrigerator. And most people didn't even use. They didn't have enough current to use a range and a stove. They still had to cook over a wood stove because of the amount of electricity that those take. They just couldn't supply that much electricity to the houses for years after the REA.
Yeah. So, do you know the name of the people who owned this house before you?
Mm-hmm. His name was Otis Mingle. He just went by OTT, Ott Mingle. And Miss Bessie, his wife, was still alive when we bought this house. Mm-hmm. And she came by. She had a grandson bring her by one time.
Because there was somebody between them.
Oh, yeah.
There were actually 2 couples.
There were two. There was the drunk couple.
The old drunk
that
couple.
were locals
Who
painted everything turquoise.
Turquoise and lavender, and they just threw all the bottles out in the hedges.
We found moonshine bottles. Every spring you'd find more of them as they'd heave up to the ground.
It was amazing how many beer cans and bottles had been.
And they were clearly moonshine bottles because of the But anyway, and then a couple from Florida bought it because the land was so cheap. This was part of the back to the land thing, and they lived here.
They crashed and burned real quick.
They did. They bought cattle. They were going to run cattle on it. They couldn't afford to feed the cattle. All the cattle died up all in there. There was when we moved here, there were still carcasses. I mean, dead. The dogs would drag down bones like crazy. And that was the first time we bought this house from O.N. Pettigo, who was an old guy realtor
real estate
and horse trader, and that sense of horse trader. And it was the first time he'd ever repossessed a house. Was on these people from Florida, and he had, I think, bought it from, what were the names of those people? I remember who that was that owned it, and then he bought it from them. They were both drunks and they just couldn't take care of it. So he bought it. He sold it to the people from Florida. He repossessed it. And then he divvied up the farm, and we got the house in 50 acres. But
the last family that had lived here successfully
were the
Mingles.
when he died,
And the Mingles built this house,
yes,
didn't they?
yes,
Yeah.
the Mingles built this house, and when he died, she moved into town, and sold it to that drunk couple.
Mm-hmm.
And then when she was quite old, she lived to be well into her 90s. She came out. Her grandson brought her out to see the house, and by then we changed a lot of it. So there was no porch when we bought it, so all of that's been added. And I was concerned that she would be upset, but she actually was very happy because somebody was living in it that took care of it. It was her home. I mean, it was a solidly built home that somebody had cared enough to put rock wool insulation in the walls and put stone in the foundation, and which was around here. It's nothing to see a house sitting on top of several rocks and on each corner, and
Not much anymore.
No, but back
when we
then-
moved here, it was very common.
yes. Yeah, and chickens running under the house eating the bugs I mean, it was very common. You'll still see it some,
Yeah,
but mostly those houses have either fallen over or people, built themselves a little brick box. That was the next thing. The next step
Put
was,
it in a trailer. Just, yeah.
but anyway, this was a house that was built by prosperous people. They hired a contractor actually to do it. Joe Davenport.
Oh, yeah.
His father built this
Right,
house.
uh-huh.
And so yes, it was, and it's only 3 miles out of town, so it's convenient. It was, and when for a long time after we lived here, there was a guy up at the top of the hill that about once a month he'd take his mules and hook them up to the buggy and go into town. And that's about all. That's that, and he didn't have a car. And
Once
that's
a
about
month. That's it. The rest of the time
Supply
it's
run.
spent up on the. Yeah.
So I mean, this was still really rural. Really, it's
Until the 4-lane came in. You came in on the 4-lane, no doubt.
without
Yeah.
Yeah. But whereas it takes 20 minutes to get to Murfreesboro, now it was more like 45
Yeah.
before. And we went a lot less often.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes. I mean, it's amazing. We used to plan trips to Murfreesboro like it was a big deal, and and sometimes and it would never be more than once a week,
Yeah.
and sometimes not that often. And now sometimes we do it 2 times in a day. It's just pitiful.
I think I prefer the 4-lane.
Well, all these people thought, well, the 4-lane was going to be so nice because it would bring stuff into town, but all it did was take people out. Makes it easier to go out. So they shop in Murfreesboro now.
Oh, I know that. I'm just thinking. Yeah, but I mean, we've got all the antique stores now. The town hasn't died in a way that the uniqueness, the country, the hillbilly uniqueness of the town has definitely died.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of amazing backwoods characters living here when we first moved here.
Oh yeah.
Real unique people with real unique outlooks on life and way of living, and that whole thing is gone. But the town hasn't died or even really gone.
It's
different.
very different because
Doesn't,
when we moved here, when we first moved here, there were 2 hardware stores in town. There were the grocery store on the square, and another one just off the square. We had 2 furniture stores. We had a small appliance knick-knack store. No, we had 2 grocery stores on the square.
Wow.
We had Lenning's and the one down Duke's,
right.
next to Duke's place, and then
And
we had 3. We had a fabric store and 3 dress shops, clothing shops,
A shoe store.
and a shoe store and shoe repair. They did sold shoes and shoe repair, and
No fast food. No.
well, we barely. Well, there was a Dairy Queen.
There was a Dairy Queen. That's right.
That's the only and the Woodbury cafeteria.
Yeah.
That was only way you could eat out, and but then the one hardware store went, then the other hardware store, and then the clothing stores went, and then the cloth shop went, and one of the furniture guys died, and that left us with we still have the one furniture store, but I mean it's like.
The point I'm making is that we now have
We do.
more businesses than you were describing. They're not as wide a spectrum.
But when we were here,
We've
the
got-
whole square was filled. It's not filled anymore.
No, but none of the businesses on either the 53 going out, or
Yeah.
all those buildings have been
yeah.
built.
We
since-
also had we
same
had
thing.
3 car dealers in Woodbury when we moved here.
Yeah.
3, and
That's right. There are none of those.
and it, I mean, it's different, and it's not really, I miss a lot of that old stuff. But one of the local stores told me one time that only the move-ins shopped at her store. That all of the local people wanted to go to Nashville and pay more because they wanted to be able to say they'd gone shopping in Nashville. And I said it's funny because everybody in Nashville wanted to shop in Atlanta. Everybody in Atlanta wants to shop in New York, and everybody in New York wants to shop in Paris. And everybody in Paris packs suitcases and goes to Walmart.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, whenever they come over, they bring empty suitcases
and go to
or
Walmart.
buy them.
Yeah.
They'll buy them at Walmart.
That's right. We have British friends who do that. They just come over and they go back with
Every day they go to Walmart. Every day.
Every day.
Wow.
And it's a 20-minute shot from here to Walmart. So, we'd get up and Ann would be gone and come back and have gone to Walmart already. So it's just that's a lot of what happened. It's like, you grew up on homemade bread and you wanted to buy store-bought bread. Then people's jobs took them other places, and so they shopped on their way home, So it's just, but the antique store has there's been some it draws people in, and we've got a few more places to eat now, so that people can come and have lunch and stuff. So it's and that's not a bad direction for the town to go. I mean, it beats having major industry polluting everything, which they've never
I
been
think
able
it
to do.
even beats having
We have a hardware store.
sweatshops like the shirt
The shirt factory was
factories.
terrible. It changed the life here so
we had
much.
several shirt factories when we first
Right.
moved here. There's one great big one and several smaller ones, but they all operated pretty much the same way. And while they gave a certain sense of vitality to the town, the fact is that they were exploiting those people horribly, paying the minimum wage and
Which
working out ways to never pay them more than minimum wage. And so it's
And it
whereas
changed-
it seemed like people were working in town, and they were. Now people go out to the big factories around.
But they're doing better on those
yeah,
jobs,
yeah,
those are
they've-
decent jobs. This is what and it was mostly women who worked at these shirt factories, and then that changed the whole home scene, and but it made it possible for those farmers to keep farming to a certain extent. Small family farm is pretty well done in. People grow, they grow
all corn.
all corn, some soybeans, but we have a really, really good, vibrant organic movement here. The farmers market and people. I mean, you can buy really good local produce in this area now, and Rutherford County too. Really, the farmers market thing is fantastic, and the local extension agents, the USDA people, have fostered that. That's been a real positive too. Made it possible for some of these guys who've been farming forever, and they actually can sell stuff. I don't know how much money they make. They don't, but it's people are doing truck farms now. So sort of back to the land.
Yeah, it is.
So, did your children remember, like, you're back to the land living? Or
The oldest one
does.
does.
The oldest one does.
Yeah.
And Emily too is small. No.
No, I don't think so.
How many children do you
They
have?
do remember gardening. We have 3, but they're very wide ages. They're 13 years from number 1 to number 3. That we still gardened. Emily remembers gardening when she was a kid. Growing vegetables and
Right.
stuff. But
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we had abandoned a lot of almost all of the overtly hippie parts of our
by the time Emily was born, see, Taylor's 8 years older than Emily, so he was 4 when we moved here. Yeah, he was 4 when we moved here, so he remembers those earlier times. Not fondly, I don't think, though. But he went to school here for a while too.
Then we pulled him out when he was starting. The schools here are still not good. They were terrible, really, and he started regressing, and so we pulled him out, started teaching him at home. And then by the time our daughter was ready to go to school, she was reading on a 4th grade level. So what are you going to do with somebody like that? Put them back in and have spend all day on thee? So we homeschooled all of our children.
Yeah, but that was very common here too, though. That was very common. That was that was shades of they were all the old back to the lander hippies that that weren't really hippies anymore, but they still had that kind of sense of independence that we can do this ourselves. We don't have to have.
And now, have you noticed that a couple of the presidential candidates are, and a lot of politicians are now proudly pointing out that they were homeschooled.
No. Well, for years, the kid who won this National Spelling Bee every year was a homeschooler.
And the science fairs too.
Yeah. That's interesting. I hadn't paid any attention to that. It's actually much more widespread now. When we started, it was really radically new, but now they have whole groups of homeschoolers that get together and do Patterson Park down here has homeschool PE. They have you can sign your kids up for homeschool PE down there.
Is that your phone?
That's my phone. It's telling me I have a notification, a message or something. So anyway, that's how far it's come.
Oh, I know.
Very different.
Scott Thompson's boys are in a sports league that's all
homeschoolers.
Homeschoolers sports league.
And they travel and they play each other and they that had changed a lot. It was it's very different. Much more mainstream now.
You were telling me a little bit ago how you would find moonshine bottles around here. Was moonshine ever made at Readyville Mill?
I'm sure they ground corn for moonshine.
No, don't you remember there was a guy who bought corn from us and just said that he was going to eat about like 600 pounds a week.
Yep.
And he just basically
everybody knew it.
Told us that he was going to make.
Well, there was an old guy years and years ago. There was an old guy that told me one time that he used to grow corn, and I got the implication of that what he used the corn for. But there's a lot more money in marijuana. Mm-hmm. And
that's what he said.
Yeah, that's what he said.
Local,
old guy.
Not a hippie.
Because if you're willing to make illegal whiskey, then you're willing to grow illegal marijuana. It's just, and most of the guys around here you can't tell us what to do anyway. They really didn't trust government or like government, so which is part of the reason they lived here because it's off the grid so much.
And part of the reason that they were so amenable to having a bunch of hippies move into their environs too, because they were already real independence minded. And like Kathy said, this was a moonshine haven. There was a still on our property.
Oh, wow.
And they got really sophisticated with it after a while. They were
operating at remote controls.
It looked like it was a hog barn, but it was all moonshine, and they would have
in a cave.
In caves, so that when they flew over, the heat wouldn't show. If you're in a cave, then the infrared wouldn't find you. And a pig barn would show hot anyway. So they had all these ways of avoiding the revenuers as such. Almost all those guys that got caught when they got sophisticated were told on. Somebody turned them in, But there was one of the ex-sheriffs of the county got arrested for hauling moonshine not that long ago.
No. Well, it was always a hand in hand. The sheriff. It was just everybody's common knowledge. The sheriff was always paid off by the moonshiners. That was when I first moved here. When I first set up my first little shop in town, I was just right down the street from the sheriff's department. and the new sheriff came into office, and the next day one of his deputies came down to my shop. He says, "You know, you're a great big old guy. Why don't you come be a deputy with us?" And I said, "You know, I don't think I'd be interested in that. What does it pay?" And he told me, I think it was like $430 a month or something like that. I said, "Oh my goodness, that's terrible. I make more than that in this little woodworking shop." He said, "Well, that ain't all you get."
Yeah. Somebody said one time that how corrupt this town was. I said, this town is no more corrupt than Mayor Daley's Chicago. It's just that you know everybody.
Everybody knows about it.
Yeah, it's actually much more honest in a lot of ways because it's right out there. And you know, it's just it makes for great stories. You know, we have legions of the stories that, you know, over the years because we've been here so long. That's the and then you know, then we had the everybody's making fun of us. We had this sheriff that got arrested, that got convicted as a felon. Junior. Yep. My brother called me from East Tennessee one day and said,
Junior made national news.
He said, "I think Junior's going to prison. What do you think?" And I said, "What are you talking about? How do you know?" He says, "Oh, it's on the news over here too." He said, "I think Junior's going to jail." I said, "Well, it looks that way." He got out of going to jail, but he got convicted. And it turns out it wasn't against the law. It wasn't to be a sheriff if you were a convicted felon, but it was against the law to carry a gun if you were a convicted felon. But he wasn't going to resign. He was going to stay sheriff because that's the most money he'd ever made in his life. And he wasn't real bright. And the way he got out of going to jail was he had to admit guilt and he had to resign. And that's then he didn't have to go to jail. So they hired him at the highway department. Mm-hmm. Yeah. They liked, you know, he was a good old boy. Everybody liked him, except the people that he did wrong. But no, that's just so. It's an entertaining place to live.
Mm-hmm. So, did any of the back to the landers at the mill? Did they ever grow marijuana?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah. We were just talking about that the other day about somebody. I was talking to somebody and they said
the better question would be who didn't.
Yeah. I mean, some of them grew big amounts because
right over the hill there was early on there was this guy. He's been busted so many times now because he just goes right back to it.
There's a lot of money in it.
He was growing so much that he had 3 trash compactors going.
He was selling it in trash compactor.
You know, they were compacting it in tight bales.
And then several people that we knew that were early hippies with us got arrested, and then they changed the law and they confiscated your property after that. And that one couple, let's start with a B. Anyway, they lost their property.
Over in Gazaway? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They lost their property, and but we know that some of them are still around here. That they were busted. That you know most of them didn't go to jail. That guy over the ridge went 2 or 3 times, but they at least one of the time they just kept him in town in the jail, and they made him a trustee, and he and some other guys went out and did the landscaping around the public buildings. So it wasn't exactly the same as, I mean, he had to go back every night, but he was out during the day. Oh my goodness, there was a lot of marijuana grown here.
Yeah, still is.
Huge amounts. There was a helicopter pilot that flew over, he worked for the TBI, I guess. Anyway, we'd hear him sometimes fly over here, but he could spot the different color of green from the air. He could tell the marijuana because people would plant it in with corn, you know, so that they would try to mask it, and he could spot it from the air, and he was really good. And he got sick and he couldn't do it anymore, or something. But I'm sure there's still a lot around here. I used to worry that somebody would grow it on our property and we'd get in trouble, but. I think it's all too overgrown up there now. We'd know, but there's still no telling. but not like I don't know that. Well, yeah, we just had that huge
I was
bust.
just going to say.
Yeah, Jeff, what's his name?
Jeff Young.
Oh my goodness, he was huge.
Yeah, he was, and I mean he was buying it from elsewhere too. But a lot of what he was selling was being grown here.
And then before that, Joe Cook.
Here being, into DeKalb County, into Warren County, somewhat into Rutherford County, and coffee too. I mean, it's just
the Joe Cook before that was he got busted for he had a 7-state marijuana ring, huge deal.
And he was mostly bringing it up
he
from
was
Mexico.
selling.
Yeah.
He was a distributor.
Yeah.
And he had a big business. He owned property in Mexico, and he
owned property everywhere. I guess.
He lost a lot of it here.
Yeah.
But and they ended up finally catching him. He skipped to Mexico, and they did a sting operation, and drew him back because they had property over in Manchester area, and they pretended they were going to buy it, and he had to come in to sign the papers, and they caught him, and he went to jail for a long time. He runs a halfway house now. That's right. So there's a huge outlaw. I mean, like I said, that old guy said there was more money in growing marijuana. It's no different to him, and it really is no different. The laws are stiffer now for marijuana, but especially a while back. If you're willing to do one illegal thing, what's the difference in doing another one? And like you said, there was more money in the marijuana, and he probably just grew a nice plot of it and sold it to somebody like Joe Cook and pocketed the money. And it's a lot less work than making moonshine too. There's still moonshine being made here too.
Yeah.
It's all small batch. It's
craftsmen. They're all very proud of their product. Now they distinguish the taste, and I mean it used to just be a commodity for getting drunk. Now the guys who are still making it are artisans.
And of course we're going to have
themselves artisans.
We're going to have legal moonshine here soon, but there's still lots of it, But it's all small batch, and you have to know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, to get any. But you can get it. It doesn't take much trouble. It's $10 a half gallon. It's the
some of it's pretty good.
Mm-hmm. No, and nobody here minds buying it.
Yeah. I've never had moonshine, so
it burns all the way down.
Yeah.
You feel it. You feel every inch of it all the way down until it hits the bottom of your stomach. It's not for the faint of heart.
Right. Well, when you said that when you and fellow hippies moved in, the locals were really accepting of you. Did you ever have locals who didn't want you here? Or?
There were a few. It happens sometimes. Jeff and Nancy had that bad experience.
They did.
And
we had an interesting experience very, very early on. As soon as we moved into the first house we moved into, when we moved into Woodbury, was just right down this road. And we hadn't lived there a week, maybe just 2 or 3 days, and it was nighttime, and there was a knock on the door, and I went to the door, and there were 2 local good old boys. I won't name them for this, but they were from just right around this area, right here.
We still know.
Yeah. And they both of them had beers hanging. They were hanging their fingers through the hoops of partially drunk 6-packs, and I mean they were pretty raw, good old boys, and you just sort of seeing their eye there. They were clearly checking us out, and maybe had a little mayhem in mind,
They kind of admitted it later, didn't they? One of them told you later that they were thinking about stirring up some trouble. They were 3 sheets to the wind.
Yeah, and I just invited them in. We said, "Come on, sit down." They said, "You want a beer?" And we said, "Sure," which to them was shocking.
Because
no decent people ever admitted to drinking beer in Cannon County.
It's certainly not a woman.
And for a woman to, and especially with them, because they were what they used to call rogues. A rogue was not exactly a criminal, but the bad element. That was the local term. They were rogues. And for anyone to drink a beer with a rogue that made you a rogue too. And so they said, "You want a beer?" And we said, "Sure." And we actually drank a couple of beers with them, and we sat there and
we talked about how many children we had, and
just where they lived, what they liked to do, and stuff like that. And by the time they left, we were all patting one another on the back and smiling, and they became, well, I wouldn't say good friends, but very good neighbors. And in fact, have ever since then have acted as protectors of us up in this hollow from other rogues.
One time
they sort of were their gatekeepers. That you leave them alone,
And one time our daughter had been attacked by a dog in Davidson County. It was bad, and one of these guys drove into the driveway to check on how she was, and we're talking about it. He said, "What happened to the dog?" And I said, "Well, it's in rabies control in Davidson County." He said, "You want me to take," I won't imitate his accent because it's rude, but he said, "You want me to take care of it?" And I said, "I think we've got it under control." But he was willing. This violated his sense of order. His dogs are always extremely well behaved. I used to run past his house, and his dogs always knew to stop. They didn't ever bother me, because when he'd see me, he'd call them back, and so they knew. But so this dog had violated what was the natural order. A person is higher up than a dog, and so in his mind, that dog should be shot.
He was going to go into Nashville.
He was going to go in and shoot the dog for me.
Right in rabies control. He's going to burst in.
Well, I don't know if those people had taken that dog home after that and kept it. I might have taken him up on it.
Right.
But we did manage to get the dog put down. But anyway, it was I was hit this whole vision of him driving up in that. But and there are other stories like that over the years that particularly that guy. He's quite an interesting guy. And we would prefer people not to hunt on our property, but a lot of these guys have been doing it for a long time. They've hunted this property. Their families have before we ever owned it, and we just never made a big deal out of it. But they started to respect our feelings about it, because we were good neighbors too. So so that that it's kept peace. If you respect each other, it makes a big difference. And one of the things that people in the South in particular, but in rural communities like this especially, really resent is they resent people moving in from outside and then telling them how it's supposed to be done. And it happens so often, and well, that's not how we did it back home, or back home it would go this way or that way, and then finally everybody starts saying, well, then move back home. You don't like it here, move back home.
Or if you're so smart, how come you're not doing it yourself?
That's,
why'd you get me to do it?
And so there were bumper stickers for a while on backs of work trucks saying, we don't care how you did it back home. And so that's really the issue, is the arrogance of people who move in, often lording it over people. And that's what did not happen with the hippies. They did not come in with this lording it over attitude. They
wanted to know how these people were living.
That's right. They came in wanting a sense of community, and that was the reason it was successful here. And then the people here were open to it. So, but we've had so many more move-ins that are, because land is cheap here, you can get to Murfreesboro real easily, and you can buy 5 acres and put a pretty big house on it for half what it would cost you in Murfreesboro and stuff like that. So, and those people a lot of times have come in and they expect services. They've moved in from places where you had running water. People buy land and don't know if there's water on it because it never crosses their mind that city water doesn't run right by there. People bought property down here, bought like 100 acres down here. They were going to subdivide it. And I asked the lady, I said, what are you going to do for water? Oh, there's plenty of water. I said, I don't know. Where do you think you're going to get the water? And she said, well, there's this big spring. I said, well, that's not on your property, is it? No. I said, well, nobody can really drill wells on this road. It's if you don't have a spring, you're in trouble for water on this road. next week the land was up for sale. They bought this property and never crossed their minds
to check the water
that they would have water, and that's just so. And a lot of times they'll come in and start making demands of the utilities, the locals, whatever, and they end up having feuds with people because they set up this bad feelings, and then their dogs end up dead.
We have a neighbor down the road like that now. It's just alienated everybody.
Yep. They moved in from, well, actually her family's from here, but
these are people that were never hippies.
No,
they're just
arrogant.
Yeah.
Yeah, they did it. They're smarter than everybody here. Is what it came down to. Boy, they got bad on the road. It was really funny because they had those little sheepy looking cows, the red ones with the long fur.
You're talking about another people, but
oh, okay. And the cows kept getting out, and it really irritated people. And finally, all the local guys down the road that are real big buddies with each other, that we know well too, just one of them got a cow poked a hole in his radiator and that was it. That was the last straw. So I came home one day and the police were down there looking, and because they were out. And then one time one of those guys' dogs was up here, and he came to pick it up because he knew where it was going to come. It was a nice dog, and he said, "Cows are out. Call the sheriff." So our son came in and called the sheriff. We just got to the point where for a while
nobody would ever used to do that.
No,
I mean, you would never call the sheriff when somebody's cow's out.
You called each other.
Yeah, and most likely what you would do was herd you knew whose cow it was, and you would herd them back into their pasture, and then call the people and tell them that they have a problem.
Well, we kept some guys 3 horses one time for days and days. They'd come up over the ridge and they showed up here, and we had a fence
to sick the sheriff on somebody for cows being out. It shows a real animosity.
Yes, and we all did it every time it happened because they were out so often. And I drove a little bitty car, and if one of those cows would have taken me, it would. Yeah. But all of us, it was sort of an unspoken pact that at a certain point, that was it. They were not good neighbors because they didn't keep their cows up, and because they were so arrogant.
Yeah.
And they don't keep anything on that property anymore. They don't. I think they still own it, but and you'll still hear people talk about them. It happened the other day. I don't like them. So.
Well, are you still friends with anybody that was a fellow hippie at the time?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah, lots of them. Mm-hmm.
Several very good friends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did they work at the mill too, like your friends? No.
One guy who's dead now, who was affected by Agent Orange in Vietnam and has since died from complications of that, lived in that house in front of the mill when we first, it's all right. When we first moved there, and lived there for at least the length of time that we
were there. Yeah.
That we were there, he and his family, and then they moved on out to a neat place out in Readyville. Well, actually, it's Burt. Yeah.
Well, they split up, and he moved out there.
No, they were still together when they moved out there.
Okay. Then they split up.
Yeah.
And he stayed there. Yeah.
So, did anyone live on the mill's property?
We did, and Terry did. And I can't remember where they. Oh, the Kerrigans lived way out to
they lived in
Centertown, between here and McMinnville. Yeah. There was a trailer in that old house. The trailer's been moved out long ago. Mm-hmm. Did the house finally flood out?
No, I think the house is all fixed up.
Oh, that's right. They fixed the house all up. That's right. Somebody fixed it all up. And Russell's Market was still there. That was a market when we were there, and still is. The post office.
Tilford's was a lot more active and going concern.
Yeah.
At the time.
The lumberyard was going a lot more.
The sawmill, actually.
Yeah, and then he has a trucking business, but I don't even think that's running anymore. So that was it. That was the community.
That was it for Readyville.
That was Readyville. And the big old house, big old Reedy house was empty a lot of that time. recently went up for auction, and I don't think it sold.
Yeah, I think it didn't.
It didn't make, yeah. It was like $100,000 is what it was. But that's not unreasonable for that house, because you know how much money you have to take to fix it again? I just, I wouldn't pay that a bunch of money for that house to then have to sink hundreds of thousands in it to bring it up to snuff. So, so anyway, that's, that was Readyville. And it pretty much still is just Readyville. That's it. What it is now is pretty much what it was then.
Well,
Except the mill
Tilford's a lot more moribund.
Yeah, and the mill was a lot more lively back then
That's
too.
what I mean. The mill and,
No, I meant
and the little
Tilford's
store.
and the mill. Yeah.
The
little store's about the same.
No, it's less.
Is it?
Yeah, I mean,
I haven't been in there in years.
I mean, he made some pretense of having groceries and hardware there for many years. Now he doesn't.
Oh, I don't know. I haven't been in there in a long time, so I don't know what he has in there. But he's still there.
Randy is.
Russell Market.
Oh! I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. I was talking about Tilford's little store.
Oh no.
No, Russell's Market. Yeah, that's it's still there. Mostly he sells beer, and chips. And,
yeah. Probably some milk. Because it's just gotten so easy to get anywhere else to buy stuff. It's, used to be those little markets were they had them all over the county.
Yeah.
And you could go in and have lunch. They'd make sandwiches. And some of them even cooked hot meals in the middle of the day. And they're almost all gone now.
Well, there's still some.
They're few and far between.
There's one out where Robert and Julie live. That one's still, and they still do that.
It stays closed.
Yeah.
It stays open a month and it's gone again.
Oh well.
And there's the one out by Short Mountain. That one still seems to.
And Parsley's Market does.
Well, yeah, Parsley's it does, and that's mostly because they're the first gas stop coming into town. But Parsley's is bigger really than all these others.
Right. They used to be.
But there used to be all these little markets that you could stop in, pick up some Twinkies. Something, yeah.
So was Russell's Market like the main place where people shopped in Readyville?
I don't know that anybody ever did their real shopping there, because there were grocery stores in Woodbury.
Yeah, but that's by the time we got here.
Yeah.
I mean, you go back 30. Well, not from now. You go back 60 years, which is even just 50 or 60 years ago, stuff was still measured according to the reasonable distance you could ride a horse buggy, not drive a car. Uncle Dave Macon, the country music star, made his living until he got famous as a artist. Made his living driving a horse-drawn cart back and forth between Woodbury and sometimes all the way to Murfreesboro, but usually just down to Kittrell and back. And so there were little general stores in every tiny little community. Every one of them separated by no more than 6 to 10 miles. So there was one in Sycamore Creek. There's one in Gazaway. Now, I mean, the difference between there may have even been one halfway between those two. And there was one in Hard Scrabble. Rock House that's on 53, isn't it? And Hard Scrabble is on Auburn Road. Just lots of little tiny communities like that.
But the other thing is that people grew their own food and canned their own food. So what you had to buy at the store, you had your own milk cow, you had your own, you slaughtered your own hog, you grew your own vegetables. So all you needed from a grocery store was coffee and flour, and there was the mill there to get the flour. So you got the coffee at the grocery store, and maybe some sugar if you could afford sugar. And that's.
There was candy,
Well, yeah, I mean there were treats that you could get, but basically
horseshoes.
A small store like that didn't have to be a grocery store like we have, because people took care of their most basic needs themselves. And when people stopped growing serious gardens, then they needed to shop. But my great-grandfather owned what they call a jobbing company in East Tennessee, and they serviced all those little stores. That their job, they had basically salesmen. They were salesmen that went out. By this time, of course, it was cars. By the time I knew anything about it, I don't know if it had ever been horse and buggy that they owned it, maybe, but they went to all these little country stores and sold them the chewing gum, the canned goods, all that kind of stuff, and they were the suppliers for all these little stores, and they just serviced small markets, and the business went out. By the time I was an adult before it closed, but my great aunts were running it by then, and it closed because of Kroger, and Kroger was the first that really did. They had the distribution idea, and once Kroger started putting stores in all these places, and you had more stuff, and then the small stores started dying, and it almost happened here, but it still may happen here, because the Piggly Wiggly was threatened really badly by the Walmart and all those down there, but still it was they did a good job of stocking the store with stuff that even people like me would want to find. I mean, I found capers in there one day. I was so excited, But that means somebody had said, I wish you had capers, and they bought them, and they don't go bad. So, and they carried all the basics that country people, and basic things that all of us would need, but they added some interesting, you could get fresh mixed greens and stuff like that, lettuce, fancy lettuces, but they did a good job of sort of keeping up so that we didn't have to go to Murfreesboro, that I could run in and I could get what I needed. And so I shopped there quite a bit over the years, but it's now going to be a Save-A-Lot, and we're not happy about that.
You sure about that?
Yes, I'm sure about that.
Oh dear. It's
going to be a Save-A-Lot. But they said they're going to keep the meat and the produce. I don't know, but there's everything in the store was 25% off except meat and produce and milk, and so, and the register stub says Save-A-Lot now, and they're going to redo the entire store. It's just, artists withstood that for a long time because the guy wanted to put a Save-A-Lot in Woodbury, and he told a friend of ours who's a real estate agent not to sell property to this guy so he couldn't bring a Save-A-Lot in town. Yeah. And so finally he sold his own business out, and the guy is turning it into a Save-A-Lot. So that we're going to miss that grocery store. They really, they did a nice job. Local people, 60 years they've been in the grocery store business. So his father and his grandfather had been. His grandfather had one of those little bitty markets that we're talking about,
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
and then moved it into town and opened a bigger store, and that's how they got started. So
you said you went to college too, right?
Mm-hmm. I went to Vanderbilt.
Yeah. What did you get your degree in?
English, French, and philosophy.
So is that how you two
Another
met?
highly useful.
yeah, we met at
So-
college.
Yeah, we met in college.
We were in the same class at Vanderbilt.
Okay. What year did you get married?
68.
Well, 68, yeah.
We were 20.
Yeah, okay.
And then we both graduated in 70. I graduated in January, he graduated in June of 70.
So where did you learn your woodworking skills?
Just sort of picked him up here and there.
There was a cool old guy here.
Yeah.
That mentored him when we first moved here. His name was Henry Hoover, and he built furniture, but he built other stuff. He built buildings. He built the old hospital that's now the school board down there, and he houses
Built the library.
and the card catalog, that was in the library. But Alf became friends with him, and he thought that his skills were going to go away, that nobody was going to do this ever again, until Alf came and started bugging him with questions and started teaching him. And so he was an influence. Alf surpassed his capacity at some point, but not before maybe even by the time Mr. Hoover knew how good you'd gotten by the time he died. But that was one thing that happened here. And this guy was terrific. I mean, he was curmudgeonly old guy, And
A lot of people in town were afraid of him.
Yeah.
And they couldn't believe that I was friends with him.
They thought for sure he would just hate this this hippie kid, and he saw in Alf the potential to pass on something, and he'd been a teacher. He taught industrial arts at the high school, so he knew, the state of the art at that point, So, but Alf's mother was the one that was good at. His father didn't know which end of a hammer to hold, but his mother knocked down furniture and put it together, and she hung her own curtains and all that kind of stuff. So
we did crafty things as kids.
His family's architects, a lot of architects in his mother's side. So that's where the direction came from.
So when did you start making furniture? Was that after you left the mill, or did you?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Actually, I had started doing woodworking in Nashville before we moved down here. And one of the conditions under which we moved to the mill was that they were going to let me set up a woodworking shop in one of the buildings and work part-time in the mill and part-time in my woodworking shop. And it became quickly apparent that it was going to be a long time before that happened. But it was my intention primarily, even before, like I said, when we moved here, I had already decided that what I really wanted to be was a woodworker. I didn't have many skills, but I had the desire. So we moved on into town, and for several more months, I worked at one of the shirt factories here. And then I got a job with a cabinet maker here in town, a small kitchen cabinet maker, and worked with him for several months, 6-8 months. And then at that point, I had accumulated enough tools and found a little building where I could just open my own shop. And actually, at that point, I still wasn't capable of making furniture. I was making kitchen cabinets and just basically whatever came along. I made a miserable slide for the playground.
Yeah, that slide was terrible. He made it go up at the end. The kids still, our daughter's age kids still laugh about it. They get on that slide, they'd slide down, and at the end it went up, and so it threw you into the air and dropped you down on it.
Well, actually, if you had enough weight, that's what I had in mind. I had in mind giving them a little thrill at the end. If you had enough weight, that's what happened. But if you were smaller, you just came down and you just sort of hit that thing
and fell off the end. That's what the girls said.
But anyway, the whole time I'm reading books and I'm haunting furniture factories and just trying to do everything I can to hone my skills. There was not nearly the resources that we have today for. There were no magazines about it.
It was really almost a dead business.
Almost a dead craft.
Yeah, at that point. Still to this day, in the furniture world, the studio furniture world, Alf's one of the old guys that there are others that are in a similar age bracket. They're also mostly self-taught because there were no schools to speak of, and so there are a few other guys that are in the age bracket that were self-taught. But there's so many more. He teaches all summer long at various schools around the country because they have them now. You can go learn the basics. And they're different emphases. Some of them are people that want to do it when they're retired. Some of it are people that really want to do it as a business. Try to get into it. And there are organized guilds and stuff.
Lots of magazines.
Yeah, lots of magazines. We take tons of them. We must, and fine woodworking was one of them that started the whole that thing. But anyway, so it's very different now. You can really get and you can even for people who've been doing it for a long time, you can hone your skills because you can go to meetings and go to things and sharpen yourself against other people.
It's one of the great things about even as a full-time occupation. There's always more to learn. There's always more to learn. If you can keep making progress. I can do things today that I couldn't do 10 years ago. As far as skills and techniques and and knowledge, and they're things that I yearn to be able to do that I can't do now. Particular fine skills and techniques.
So, when you worked at the mill with Joe Flipsy, he kind of taught you a lot about how to work with wood, with the mechanics,
Mostly
and stuff
metal.
or mostly metal
Well,
in the mill, or
No, neither really. What Joe taught me was ingenuity, just how to take a minimum of materials and to put them together in a strong but simple way to accomplish a job, and just not to be afraid of the process of doing that. Don't be afraid to imagine it, and then do it. And if something breaks, you don't have to necessarily go out and buy a new one. You can fix the thing that's broken, and what can you do to fix it? We used together. He and I every now and then use some simple woodworking tools, or some even simpler metalworking tools, but mostly it was just going around the mill and tightening up this bolt, or greasing this bearing, just learning which of the levers operated which of the, and what were the idiosyncrasies of some levers. Some levers you had to quickly push in all the way in, Others you had to kind of ease them up to a point and watch that belt just start to move and start to slip, and then you eased it on into place, And all those quirky little things. I didn't actually learn much specific woodworking from Joe Flipsy. What I learned was the value of native ingenuity.
so through the things you learned with him, did you eventually sort of get into a place where you were sort of in charge at the mill?
No,
Or, no. Okay.
no, they didn't. They wouldn't have it. I should have been. I should have been. If I had been, we would have stayed.
And
Because they didn't know anything
and the
about
mill
it.
would
They
have
were
been
just-
more successful
Yeah.
because they didn't know anything about running it. The
Under
Carrignans.
Not the
And the
Flipsies.
Flipsies he never actually worked for. He just went
No,
down
no.
and hung out with him.
Yeah.
So, but under the Carrignans, they didn't hire a manager. They hired a worker. And in that regard, that was one of their mistakes. Was if they had let somebody who had more skill in because Bill had no skill whatsoever. I mean, he was not, and they then the mill might have been able to continue running, but it was always going to be such a close margin for profit that being able to pay somebody to do that was an issue as well. I mean, there's just not a lot of profit in that business.
No.
And especially, I mean, they were trying to live off of it, and there wasn't enough for two families, so there was no question that was just, and then once they were on their own, then they couldn't keep it up. So, just the realities. I have to get back to work.
Okay.
Do you have any more questions?
Oh yeah. Just one more thing I wanted to ask about there. At the mill, did African Americans work there too, or was it?
I never saw any.
There were very few African Americans in this
Yes.
community. Very few. There were basically virtually no slaves. One or
That's
two over the history. This was a poor community.
This has always been a hillbilly dirt farmer
Right.
community. There's no railroad. There's never been a landed gentry, and so consequently, like Kathy said, there were never any slaves.
I think there's somebody had. I think a house slave. That house that's next to Regions.
Right.
That was Roy Freese had.
The Hancocks,
Houston's.
or,
Hancocks. Before whoever built that house
Right.
built that house. There and I always heard that they had a house slave.
Right.
And other than
And
that,
I think out there, the plantation out at at
oh,
Rock
Pat,
House.
yeah.
I think they had one or two.
But it was also, it was a
But-
beautiful old house. burned down. But it was, yeah, they made, but that's it. I mean, because somebody was asked one time, said, that house over there, you suppose that was a slave house? I said, no, that was a poor white people house. You know,
actually, I think probably the plantation that was around the Reedy mansion probably had.
May have. It's flatter there, and they may have had bigger fields. Right. In order to have slaves, you had to have fields big enough to work them, and that's not what was going. This was hill farms, and it was basically poor. I mean, to this day, the African American community in Cannon County is tiny, just tiny, and so
it's well integrated, but it's. I mean, we've had a black mayor he's not presently, but for a very long time, the mayor of Woodbury was a black man.
And when we came here, when we moved into town itself in the mid '70s, there was a black cheerleader at the high school.
Yeah, and then very shortly after that, the president of the Lions Club was a black man, which is sort of the same kind of tolerance that we've been talking about. You know, that I mean, the people around here are just. What they admire is strong self-sufficiency. So whatever else there is about you is not so important, you know.
There was a lot of bigotry here, and I think if the community had been larger, there might have been more strife. But because one old guy years and years ago said, you know, the good thing about the blacks here is they know their place. And so they didn't stir up trouble, but they worked. They, you know, there was Miss Annie Cox was teaching. She taught forever at the West Side School and was hugely, dearly loved by everybody who was ever in her class. And she taught 3 or 4 generations of kids.
Yeah, that's the Readyville community there.
Yeah, and so, you know, they were not, the black people in this community were not mistreated, you know, by and large.
You're right that there was bigotry, and consequently there was some mistreatment. I always hated the way, you remember Buckwheat? Mm-hmm. Now he was not mistreated in a really malicious way.
No, but he was
very much mistreated
he was limited, and he used to go around and sweep up shops. And I took Taylor to get his hair cut in one of the local barber shops, and never went back because the barber was so it was awful. It was so demeaning.
They would make jests at his, you know.
Yeah, and he just kept his business and swept up and then left. And I thought, and that guy was supposed to be, the barber was super religious, you know, big church guy. And I remember thinking, I never went back in that shop, and I never had any dealings with him ever again because he offended me so badly at the way he treated this guy who was powerless to return,
right?
For several reasons.
It's just the thing, like kids, you know, pick on somebody your own size is what.
Yeah.
So I mean, certainly there was that, and there remains a residual racism in the hearts of a lot of the local people, and certainly in the hearts of people who've moved in too. But it's always less of an issue here than in a lot of other places.
It's a very tight community. The very small African American community here is also very tight. They're all related to each other, and they have their own church, and they all go. They want to go to church there, and you know.
There's no gangsta ghetto thing happening, and so, like I say, I think it's quite a testimony that with in Woodbury. You know, when the Ronnie was first elected mayor, probably about 78?
Not Ronnie.
Was his name?
Oh, I can see him. He runs the EMS.
Right.
Cope. Ricky.
Cope. Yeah, Ricky. He was elected mayor in 78, and
no, it was way after that. He was mayor in the early 90s.
He was mayor for a long time.
He was mayor for quite a while, but it was long after that.
Well, in any case, like Kathy says, it's not because there were a lot of black people to cast their votes for him. He was elected mayor by white people.
That's right.
So it was not too bad here.
And Charlie Brown was probably president of the Lions Club, which is the major club like that here in the 80s. He came back from the military.
Well, I know he was president of the Lions Club in the 70s. Because
No, he can't have been, Alf. He can't have been because no, it had to be the 80s. We can look because he didn't even come back. He wasn't even back until the late 70s, and they let him join. He joined the Lions Club maybe in the late 70s, but he wasn't president right away.
I know
he
that.
didn't come back from the military until shortly after, or sometime after we moved here.
That's what I'm saying.
So
we moved here in 74.
But
so we were here in 74.
But we weren't in Woodbury till 75, 76. We
were in Woodbury in 74.
What I'm trying to explain to you is he came in at that point. He wasn't even in the Lions Club right away.
I'll tell you when I met Charlie.
Okay.
When he was back in Woodbury, when I was working for the old cabinet maker. So that was still 74. Yes, it was.
75?
No, it was not. It was 74.
Okay, because
I met Charlie, and Charlie was already back in 74.
Okay, and he wasn't a member of the Lions Club right away.
Well,
and then he got into the Lions Club, and he wasn't president right away.
No, I know all
so,
that.
So he wasn't president of the Lions Club until into the 80s, sometime. The time scan, it wasn't that compacted because he was in the community, he was real active and everything, but he didn't get elected president until he'd been around for a while.
Yeah.
So it was into the 80s.
Well, I don't know. I'm not convinced yet, but
I bet I can look it up.
I bet you can.
But yeah, that's the thing is that the community. What happened in this community was really interesting. They used to have a black elementary school, and then they bused the black high schoolers into Murfreesboro to the black high school during segregation. And at some point, they looked up and said, this is really expensive, having to bus those, 5, 6 kids is all they were sending at a time because the community wasn't that large. They said, this is stupid. Why don't you just let them go to school here? And so I don't know if they closed the black elementary school right away, but the high school got integrated way before it was integration because it was just economically feasible to do that. So by the time we were here, because I had taught through the busing in Nashville, the school was already well integrated. Like I said, there was one of the most popular kids in school was this black football player. He was Charlie Brown's nephew, and Dillard, and he was really good. And the cheerleader, and there was, the high school was a well integrated community because I substituted there. But like I said, the black students, black people in the community are just a very small percentage of the population. It's not a very big community even then. I mean, the whole community is not that big, so population stayed fairly steady the whole time we've been here. It hadn't really grown, but it hadn't gone away either. So,
all right.
Okay.
Well, all right. Well, I know you're busy. Is there anything else that you wanted to add about the mill or the community or anything like that?
We could tell you stories for hours.
We can tell you funny stories about the community for a long time, but none of us have that kind of time.
Okay. Well, I just have one more thing to ask. Okay. Do you consent to donate this interview to the public domain so that we can share it with others?
Yes.
We do.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.